Hi, it's Paul, and today I'm an old man with an answer to a question that was posed on my original raised planting bed video. The comment from Stuart was, I'm planning on building 3 oblong planters on a much steeper incline, so one on a stepped design. Could you give me any advice on it, or is it pretty self-explanatory as I do it? Okay, a couple of things first. Generally speaking, I don't give direct advice, but Stuart's question is open enough to bring some generic points up and sort of think about possible solutions. My thought process on all of this, on advice per se, on anything, is it would be very wrong for me to give direct advice to any individual on anything, because without knowing exactly what they're doing and where and when and all the rest of it, it's open to all sorts of drama. So I won't do it. However, as said, Stuart's question is quite open and not specific, so I can talk generics about how I would look at the problem, or some of the problems that Stuart might encounter or anyone else might encounter. So with all that waffling done, let's get on. So with the aid of SketchUp, which I'm really not very good at, here's an approximation of a 45-degree incline in a garden, let's say. It's conveniently flat, even though it's at an incline, which is very helpful if you're building stuff and not real world accurate, but hey ho. So we've got our garden at 45 degrees, and then we've got our construction, which in my mind's eye, I have a vision of it being both vertical and horizontal. Above ground, I've got structure that's going to be functional, if you like, in that it's got to support the earth and the contents, vegetables, flowers, whatever. But it may also need to be visually attractive, so I've got to consider that. Then below ground, I've got structure that's going to have to be supporting, if you like, and stable. The depth you're going to go to below ground is going to have to relate to what's above ground, how stable it's got to be, what it's got to support, and all the rest of it. It may also relate to how much effort you want to put into digging holes. And of course, it may also relate to what ground you're putting it on. In this particular instance, this raised bed that I did in the front garden is actually on a blockwork drive, and I didn't bury it in the drive at all. It is all above ground. In fact, the soil doesn't even touch the block paving because it's supported on a composite structure within the raised bed. Going back to above ground, as I say, you might just be happy with a functional finish, or you might want to put something decorative like a step in or something along those lines. Although at this point I will add in a quick note. Once you get above a few degrees out of horizontal, in other words, once you get a slope on the finished level of the bed, what you tend to get is migration of soil from one end to the other. So going back to the stepped design, what you would need to do is put some support across to stop the soil basically falling down the hill. Incidentally, I think this is what Stuart is exactly planning. I think he's planning square boxes or rectangular boxes going up the hill. And so what you would have in that case is something that from the side would look like this, sort of steps going up the hill, and from the top, I've only showed 2 sides, but you'd have at least 3 sides, possibly even a back to it as well, and you would continue up the hill as far as you needed to go with as many boxes you needed to go. But the important thing is you'd have a divider at each step in the level. So to go back to Stuart's question about what would you need to think about, any advice, blah, 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 what I would be thinking about in this situation, aside from what's going on under the ground and the basic construction of it, I'm thinking about how I want it to look when it's finished, how easy it's going to be to build, and what material I'm going to need to use it, which equates to cost, if you like. So Stuart says he's building oblong boxes, and that in and of itself makes things a lot easier in terms of construction, because it means that in theory all of the joints are square. That means all the cuts are straight cuts directly across the wood at 90 degrees. The only exception to that might be if you wanted to add some kind of finish at the top level where you'd got a mitered corner, for instance. So provided you've got a miter saw or a circular saw or whatever that will cut through the depth of the material, all you're doing is cutting an angle across the material, a single angle, with the blade in an upright or 90-degree position, which is where you get the most depth of cut. If you want to do something like compound angle finishes or joints, which I did to finish off the top sections on the other raised bed project that I did, then it becomes more of a drama, because you then have to have your miter saw or your circular saw not only cutting straight through at one angle, but you've also got to angle the blade to cut on a bevel. And the result of leaning the blade over to get the bevel is that your cutting depth can be reduced by up to half. And certainly for me, where I did this, the complexity that added was that I couldn't cut the whole way through from one side. With the straight cuts and the one single angle cuts, I could go through in a straight line with my big miter saw because I had the right depth of cut. When I was doing the bevel cuts, cutting a bevel cut reduces the amount of cutting depth you've got, and you end up having to mess about cutting from both sides, and you may even be in a situation where you can't cut deep enough on either side and you have a section in the middle that isn't cut. There is a limit to the cutting depth of any saw. Doesn't matter what the saw is, doesn't matter whether it's a table saw, miter saw, track saw, circular saw, even a jigsaw or a reciprocating saw. They all have a limit to their cutting depth, and once you reach that limit, then you have an issue if the wood that you're trying to cut is thicker. I'll probably do a completely separate video on that because it does raise some questions. So for a quick recap, I'm thinking about what I've got to do. Have I got to do anything under the ground to stop it sliding down the hill or to make sure it's stable? If I'm not burying it into the ground and I'm just laying it on top, do I still need to consider, is it likely to fall down the hill? Incidentally, should you be thinking, oh, this one's touching the house and it's going to compromise the damp course and whatever, it isn't. It's 6 inches away. It's the 4-inch grating plus 2 inches, and the thing that stops it moving anywhere are 2 metal plates that are at the front of the grating, which you can't see, and I can't show you them because they're concealed, and that keeps it where it is. Except on the very rare occasion where the neighbour's a bit careless the way he drives his car and he runs into it and pushes it sideways. But less said about that, the better. I'm thinking about what it's going to look like visually, whether I just want plain straight joints or whether I want to make it look a bit tidier with some mitered joints. I'm thinking about materials. I'm thinking about, am I going to build it just out of straight sleepers, or am I going to do some sort of post and board construction that's going to make it cheaper and easier to build, but it's going to look less robust, shall we say? And I'm thinking about whatever construction I decide to do, have I got the tools and equipment to build it? In my situation, I tend to buy everything, which is a very expensive way of doing things. You can hire all of this equipment if you look hard enough. So miter saws, sight saws, all that sort of thing, circular saws, you can hire all of it, and it's probably a good way to go. So I would say out of the two that I built, this one in the back garden presented the least amount of challenges, because even though it's got a number of complex angles in it, they are all upright 90-degree cuts. The one in the front garden, which has bevel cuts in it, was more complex. And one final thing that occurs to me that people might wonder is how I cut the full length of timber that's angled at the bottom where it touches the ground. The answer is I didn't. I haven't got anything that will cut anywhere near the full thickness of the width of a sleeper, which in this case is 400mm or 8 inches. I've got nothing that approaches that. The deepest cut I think I've got is 80mm, which is 3 inches. I can cut that on my circular saw and my table saw, sight saw, but that would still leave me a 2-inch gap in the middle of the timber that would need cutting by hand or something. I cheated. Running across the bottom of the slope parallel to the front of the house is full thickness, full width sleeper that I didn't need to taper in any direction. That supports the house end of the second sleeper up, the second layer if you like, and the other end of that sleeper rests straight on the ground. The space underneath is filled in with a wedge of thinner timber. I think it's about 40mm thick, and so it's just a panel that's inserted afterwards. So there you have it. I hope that's helped Stuart or anybody else come to that. I'm quite happy to help anyone. If you've got any questions or comments, by all means throw them below or over on the website oldmanwith.com. There's a blog post on there about the raised beds as well. I'm quite happy to answer questions on how I've built the stuff I've built. Like I said earlier, I won't give direct advice, but if I've got an answer that I can give you for something, then like I say, I will try and help, and happy to do so. Okay, thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.